The topic of this video is kind of a mouthful. It's called multiplicative property of equality with integers. And we're going to use this property to solve equations. But in a nutshell, what we're doing is we have an equation that has a variable with a number, and in order to solve that equation, we need to multiply or divide. That's kind of all we're doing. It's going to be a very basic part of the beginning part of algebra of solving equations. The part of the topic called with integers just means that you're using positive and negative numbers, but no positive or negative fractions and no positive or negative decimals. Just straightforward whole numbers that are positive or whole numbers that are negative. So let's just jump right into it. Most people that have had algebra before will be pretty familiar with the way these things look. So again, it's just kind of the first stepping stone into getting into more complicated areas of algebra and solving equations. So this is an equation. We know it's an equation because it has an equal sign. One side of the equation has the variable and the other side does not have a variable. When I say side of equation, I mean that the equal sign kind of splits this equation into two sides. And that's a pretty common thing that you'll hear. So when we look at the side with the variable, it says negative 14w. Our goal is to get the w by itself, which means we need to remove the negative 14. When we look at what operation is occurring between the negative 14 and the w, there's no like plus sign there, there's no minus sign, there's no division sign, there's really no multiplication sign. But if you have learned some of the things in algebra, just having a number next to a letter like that, it does imply multiplication. So that is one way to write multiplication. All that rounded explanation is just to bring about the fact that these are multiplied, and to solve this equation we need to undo the multiplication. We undo by using the opposite. The opposite of multiplication is division. So we're going to show our work by drawing a fraction bar, which is another way to show division, and showing that we're dividing by negative 14. If you remember your fractions, if you have any number over itself, it just reduces down to 1. And that's exactly what happens. These two numbers just reduce. Sometimes we put the 1, sometimes we don't when we go to rewrite. It could go either way. Thing about solving equations is if you do something to one side of the equation, you have to do it to the other side. Otherwise, you're doing something completely illegal. It's not kosher. So on the right-hand side of the equation, we now have negative 28 divided by negative 14. If you have a sense of math facts in your head, you'll know that that's going to reduce down to a positive 2 because a negative divided by a negative is a positive. And on the other side of the equation, we just have a 1w. Once you get used to doing algebra, you'll know that 1w or just a plain w is the same thing. So both of these say exactly the same thing. All right, let's figure out if we can determine if our answer is correct. Whenever you solve an equation and you get down to an answer, you can always check it to see if you're right. And the way that you check it is you rewrite the original equation, which was this, and then you plug in the answer that you got. So is negative 14, there's w, but I'm putting in the 2. Is that going to equal negative 28? That's what we need to double check. A negative times a positive will give us a negative. 14 times 2 does give us 28. So yes, negative 28 is equal to negative 28. So we know we did the problem correctly. Another problem here. Let's say we have, v divided by 5 equals negative 49. All right, again, we have two sides to the equation. One side has a variable, the other side does not. So we just need to concentrate on the side that does have the variable and try to get all of the numbers away from it. The v is being divided by a 5. All right, and the best way to tackle this problem is just kind of work through the logic. If the 5 is dividing into v, how do we undo that? Well, you undo division by using multiplication. And that's how you show your work. You're showing that if you want to get into fractions, you can. But you're just showing that you're multiplying by the 5, and what's going to happen is they're going to immediately cancel out. So the v isn't even going to be multiplied by the 5. The v is just going to stay the same, but the 5s are gone. And then over here, we need to remember to multiply that by 5. So we need to figure out what negative 49 times 5 is. So I'm going to do that off to the side. 9 times 5, that's 45. 5 times 4 is 20 plus 4. So I'm going to get 245. I need to remember that when I multiply a negative times a positive, I'll get a negative. So my final answer for this will be v equals negative 245. So we've used the multiplicative property of equality by solving this equation just with the fact that the opposite of multiplication is division, the opposite of division is multiplication. That's really kind of the bring home message here. All right, let's try one more, and then I'll give you a couple on the next slide that you can try on your own. Let's say that we have negative 16 equals 8b. So again, two sides to the equation. There's only variables on one side. We have to figure out how to undo the multiplication that's occurring between the 8 and the v. You undo multiplication by division, and you show your work that way. I'm also just going to add here that a lot of folks can just do this in their head without having to show any work. They just ask themselves, 8 times what number will give me a negative 16, and they can just figure that out. That's 100% fine for, for my purposes. But for folks that kind of get terrified by algebra, haven't seen algebra, need to show their work for algebra, this is kind of the big process of doing it. All right, so our 8's are going to cancel out on the right-hand side of the equation, leaving us just the v. And then over on the left-hand side, we need to do the division out. Negative 16 divided by 8 will give us 2, but it will be a negative 2, because a negative divided by a positive is negative. All right, let's turn to the next page. Let's do negative x over 7 equals negative 32. And then we'll try, how about 13m equals negative 52. The top one's actually worth talking about just for one reason that makes it a little bit different than the other one, and that's the negative sign on the fraction. Textbooks and math problems on worksheets tend to put that negative sign floating out in front of the fraction. I'm not sure exactly why. Whoops, hold on. So we have negative floating out. What I like to do is, I don't appreciate the wishy-washiness of it, so I put that you can either put the negative sign on the top, or if you want, you can put it on the bottom. And like I was starting to say, I tend to just choose one of those, because having the negative sign floating out in front, it doesn't commit you. The x can't be negative and the 7 can't be negative. They can't both be negative. And that's kind of what I think this implies. I feel like if you have the negative sign floating out in front, people tend to think that both of these are negative, and that's not true. Only one of them is negative. So that's just a long explanation, but it's something that if you can just get in the habit of sliding that negative sign either to the top or to the bottom, I think it will help you out really well. So for my purposes, I'm going to bring it down and make the 7 negative. And now I have to think about what's the negative 7 doing. It is dividing, and the opposite of division is multiplication. So I need to figure out what 32 times 7 is. So 32 times 7, 7 times 2 is 14, 7 times 3 is 21. So just the multiplication of those two plain numbers, positive is 224. I have a negative times a negative. Luckily, a negative times a negative will give me a positive, so my answer is just going to be 224. All right, the bottom and the last equation that we're going to solve for this video, we have 13 times some number equals negative 52. Again, some of you will know that answer right away. If you play cards with a normal deck of cards, you'll probably know that answer right away as well. You'll just have to think about positives and negatives. Regardless, 13 times m, we're going to undo that multiplication by division. 13s will cancel right out. We're left with m equals, and a negative divided by a positive is negative, and 52 divided by 13 will give you 4. So we have an answer of negative 4. All right, thanks for listening.